How's it everyone who's watching this? This is my 84th video on my channel, and today we're continuing with Science and Machines by Maurizio Lazzarato, a fascinating book that explores the processes behind subjectivity under capitalism through a lens largely influenced by the asignifying semiotics of Felix Guattari. In this particular episode, we'll be exploring some of these processes as they existed in the past, how they work today, and their relationship with radical politics. If you haven't watched the first video in this series, don't worry. I've only just gotten back into making these videos, so I'll be essentially recapping some themes for even just myself as we go through. I also want to take a quick moment to say that the channel now has a Redbubble store, with designs like these made by me and the amazing artist Dialogue, who does most of the sprites for the channel. I'll have a link to it down in the description, and in a pinned comment. There's also a Patreon if you would like to support the channel. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. Lazzarato begins the first section we'll be looking at today, titled The Egyptian Megamachine, by explicitly turning his attention to machinic enslavement. If you don't recall or haven't watched the last video in this series, this is the process by which individual subjects are broken down into parts that can then be essentially merged with machines. Guattari often gives the example of driving whilst tired. At some point, you as a distinct whole fall away, as your reflexes basically plug into the car. Parts of you are enslaved by the machine, acting more like bits of objects than anything else. This idea for Lazzarato is crucial for understanding capitalism and its relationship with subjectivity. Advertising, for instance, separates out the many dimensions of our identities to then incorporate them into broader economic and media-based machines. However, following American sociologist Lewis Mumford, Lazzarato also sees the modern system as essentially a resurrection of sorts. The machinic enslavement of capitalism today is simply the revival of the so-called myth of a machine, an exemplar of which emerged with the pyramids in Egypt. Setting the scene, our author offers a quote defining machinic enslavement from A Thousand Plateaus.
There is enslavement when human beings themselves are constituent pieces of a machine that they compose among themselves and with other things, animals, tools, under a higher unity.
In the case of the archaic megamachine, the one that gave us the pyramids, Lazzarato says that it's mainly social rather than technological. However, whilst it might have looked a little different from the stock market or mediatic empires of today, the same basic aspects were all there. To make some of Lazzarato's implied connections with Guattari a little more specific, we can see this by turning to what the latter calls the four functors, only used here for the sake of illustration. As you can see, Guattari often thinks about things in terms of flows, phyla, territories, and universes. These are divided along two axes, reality possibility and actuality virtuality. Beginning with the actual left side, we find flows of human labor and semiotic signs as the real element, alongside the people harnessed for the construction of the pyramids, fully keeping in mind that they weren't slaves. The archaic megamachine relied quite heavily on the transmission of orders through signs, which had the further consequence of making people accountable to those orders with a written record. Next, if we move just a little up, we find possible machinic phyla, the traditions and evolutionary tapestries which gave rise to the simple tools they did have. In addition to this, we can locate an incorporeal, virtual side to the whole operation. Beginning with the possible, there were universes of value that conditioned the megamachine, such as the myths surrounding the divinity of royalty, that justified the process of machinic enslavement in the first place. Finally, ending with the bottom right, this all tied into the production of subjectivities, or territories, that could be captured by the system. Paraphrasing Mumford quite closely, workers, in the specific context of working, were basically shaped to have a new kind of mind, to be more mechanical in how they engaged with their orders. Without getting into the specific consequences of this fourfold model, something mutated when it was revived in a capitalist world.
Capitalism profoundly changed the forms of enslavement. It progressively reduced the number of human operators and multiplied the more reliable, mechanical, electronic, and chemical ones.
The basic elements are all there, but in a bit more of a generalized way. For Lazzarato, neoliberalism specifically is marked by how far-reaching its form of enslavement is, as well as the central importance occupied by technical machines in its functioning. Beyond the context of the workplace, such machines have become more and more crucial in everyday life, from you consuming videos like this one on your phone, to me writing a script on my computer. This all comes back to an idea we discussed last episode, that of the awkward-to-say humans-machines system. This essentially just describes networks where divisions between the person element and the tool element blur together. If you can remember, machinic enslavement doesn't occur in a vacuum. It's related to another process, that of subjection. Here, to quote from A Thousand Plateaus again,
There is subjection when the higher unity constitutes the human being as a subject linked to a now exterior object, which can be an animal, a tool, or even a machine.
this is generally what gives us the nice clean binary of object-subject. I use the object, so I am the subject. For quite a long period of human history, subjection kept this pretty difficult to reverse. Sure, things got a little bit blurry in the factory environment, but enslavement was at least a little restrained when it came to when and where it was most dominant. However, with automation, everything became more general and encompassing. Humans, machines, systems bled into all of society, not just the economic sphere. This takes us to the next section of Science and Machines, which Lazzarato fittingly titles The Functions of Subjection. Even though the illusion of a strict separation between the me and the it was basically shattered when neoliberalism came along, at least on a functional level, that doesn't mean subjection just disappeared. In fact, Lazzarato is insistent that one of the features that defines capitalism is what he calls its dual regime of subjectivity. On the one hand, subjection is at work shaping specifically individual subjects. On the other hand, enslavement takes bits and pieces from a whole range of subjectivities, be they human or not. At the end of the day, these two dimensions complement each other, although that isn't to say that they are on equal footing. What I mean is that Lazzarato is pretty clear that enslavement comes first. Capitalism, in his eyes, is fundamentally just a series of machinic processes. The caveat, though, is that those machinisms couldn't really exist without subjects to work on and through. These social instruments linked to things like school, management, and so on need subjection to produce the person of a teacher as distinct to the person of the student, or the person of the manager as distinct to the person of their employee. The theme of the individual is also really important here, finding support from all across the social sciences, be it linguistics, psychoanalysis, or economics. However, for Lazzarato, property rights are perhaps the most central tool in subjection's arsenal.
By dividing the assemblage into subjects and objects, they empty the latter of the capacity to act and produce, assigned only for individual subjects whose principal characteristic is being an owner.
Beyond simply the economic dimensions at play, this has the major consequence of positioning the world, emptied of everything subjective or even proto-subjective, as an object relative to man. On top of this fundamental distinction, which Guattari classifies as molar insofar as it has to do with distinctly delimited things, even more subjections can occur. Cultural hierarchies are grafted onto that of humans over nature, such as those that privilege one race over another, one gender over another, ability over disability, so on and so on. This actually plays a bit of a foundational role when it comes to Lazzarato's view of capitalism, as it clears the ground for more economic hierarchies to take shape. In this diagram, you can see a modified figure from the Machinic unconscious by Guattari, where the molar overlaps the so-called molecular, basically those bits and pieces that aren't quite individuated. Both capitalist subjection and revolutionary politics are concerned with this little intersection. However, whereas the former takes the machinic molecular and flattens it into simple dualisms for the social molar, like subject-object or owner-non-owner, Lazzarato believes that the latter distinguishes itself on at least two main points. First of all, his idea of radical politics fundamentally critiques the molar dualisms that come with subjection. Taken as a whole, subjectivation, in the basic sense of the creation of individual subjects, is pretty crucial. In some sense, I have a subjectivity, you have a subjectivity, everyone, or even everything, has a subjectivity. The thing to note, though, is that capitalist subjection empties the nuance that comes with these subjectivities. Radical politics, from this point of view, must deal with the molar, but in a way that interrogates the functions played by the various elements involved in subjectivation. Moving on to the next point, as Lazzarato says,
Radical politics has the second end of taking enslavement's desubjectivation as an opportunity for producing something other than paranoid, productivist, consumerist individualism.
The relationship between molar and molecular doesn't go one way. Enslavement, as we've discussed, breaks down subjectivity. The problem is that this often leads into dangerous waters, since once subjection kicks in, you have all these molecules being forced into a certain binary mold, no matter how well they fit together. The consequence, as Lazzarato relates, is frequently fear and guilt. The goal he is proposing with radical politics is to reveal the choice between being a cog in a machine or an isolated individual as a false one. It's on this note that Lazzarato shifts focus a bit to why an account of machinic enslavement is so important, starting with some issues he finds in the work of Alain Badiou and Jacques Rancière. Because they only focus on social subjection, he sees them as falling victim to an odd sort of Marxist Platonism. Lazzarato is actually pretty harsh in his critique here.
They end up distorting capitalism so much that they can hardly explain the processes of political subjectivation that are supposed to take place.
Describing their approach as analyzing the distribution of the sensible, he charges the two philosophers with missing the highly specific nuances of how such distributions come to be. They might see no problem with assimilating Greek democracy and capitalism, but for Lazzarato, such a move is fundamentally flawed because it doesn't take machines into account. Even if the molar side of things is relatively similar between two situations, the molecular dimension might not be, leading to an inability to understand both what grounds subjection and the very specific nuances of each system. This general critique extends to Michel Foucault and his concept of governmentality, but Lazzarato is a bit less harsh in his assessment. This notion is largely concerned with the practices that regulate individual subjects, particularly on the level of a state. As traditionally understood, governmentality generally works in the molar order of subjection. However, for Lazzarato, it is important to expand Foucault's general idea to the molecular realm of individuals, a term famously used by Deleuze to describe the parts of subjects that enslavement draws out of people. Rather than the state, private businesses are most involved in the machinic governmentality in question. To give an example, social media sites from Reddit to YouTube collect data on the various facets of individual users, their gender, beliefs, relationship status, what they buy, so on and so on. When sold to advertisers and such, these data banks of information aren't considered to belong to full people. Instead, they are individuated, separated into broad demographics that can then be exploited for the sake of selling things. Coming back to governmentality proper, complementing its molar dimension with a molecular one makes it possible to better understand how elements outside of the conscious subject are regulated, from desires and affects to beliefs and what Lazzarato calls the sub-representational reality of subjectivity. Getting near to the end of this section of a book, we can sum things up by saying that the double regime of neoliberal subjectivation works by enslaving us to machines, be they economic or mediatic, and by assigning us or subjecting us to specific roles in the social. This all might sound a bit abstract so far, but an example might help. As Lazzarato says,
Subjection and enslavement are functions that can be assured by a single person or distributed among different people.
He illustrates this with a corporation where employees are enslaved to automation, forming something of a mixed system with nothing but inputs and outputs really mattering. If some disruption occurs, like an accident or an equipment failure, then subjection takes hold. There are subjects again, some to blame, some to explain what happened. The point is ultimately to find a way back to enslavement. Once things are fixed and the subjects have done what they have to do, employees, or their individual pieces, can just plug back in. When it comes to radical politics, this raises some important questions, especially when it comes to whether or not machinisms can be used for good. It's on this note that we get to the end of what we'll be looking at in this video, having further explored the processes that Maurizio Lazzarato considers to define subjectivation under capitalism. I'm hoping to be able to be a bit more active here. A few videos on glossomatics are currently in the works, although I'm not sure when they'll be all done. I truly hope you enjoyed or learned something, and if you feel I got anything wrong or wasn't as clear as I could have been, please do feel free to let me know in the comments so I can do better. Next time, we'll likely be continuing with either this or Guattari's seminars. Until then, bye!